Welcome to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. My name is Alice. I am one of the SLEERICKETS co-hosts. Thank you all for listening. I am here this week to shepherd you into a conversation that, to me, sounds like the plot of a movie made circa 2002 starring, what was that guy's name? Not Ryan Gosling, but like the other Ryan, the other blonde-haired Ryan Philippe. Yes, this movie stars Ryan Philippe. This week we have a conversation between Matthew and Brian about two separate scandals that erupted at the same prestigious private school in Brooklyn. You probably wouldn't make a movie about it because it's too shocking and unbelievable that both these things have happened at the same school. So Matthew and Brian are discussing two articles. The first one was published in the New York Times in July 2023. It's titled, "An Elite School, a Boy's Suicide, and a Question of Blame." And the second story is simply titled, "The Shame of St. Anne's. How did a Brooklyn private school fall for an accused predator?" I could try to summarize the details of these stories, but really it's best that you hear it from Brian, because Brian has kind of an insider's perspective on all this. There is even more to this story in The Secret Show. I'll tell you about that at the end. But for now, here's Matthew and Brian on the truly insane world of independent education in New York City.
And now we'll lose you for the rest of the episode as we talk about two totally horrifying things that happened at the same highly prestigious Brooklyn private school.
So I am fascinated by your interest in this issue because this is very much my world. I live in Brooklyn and I send my kids to a sort of second tier prestigious New York City independent school. So it costs the same amount. All the teachers went to fancy places. We, compete against but like I attended a school called Dalton for high school, which is, like in the top, whatever, 1 to 5 fanciness schools in the world. I mean, or in the United States, at least. And I teach at, like the school where I teach would think of itself as on that level, but outsiders would not think of it. And Dalton would not think of it as on that level either. But attending one of these schools, teaching at one of these schools, having my kids at one of these schools, and then the fact that I run this tutoring business where we're teachers who tutor is the only tutoring company in New York City where all of our tutors are professional educators from city schools, which means that I have unusual insight into all sorts of schools, charter, independent, and public. But
is especially you plugged your company on the show?
Yeah, first time.
Teachers who tutor. Go if you live in New York. Go get your students tutored by teachers who tutor.
Is that the jingle? Did you just record the jingle?
I think I did. You can have that one.
In New York, go get your students tutored by it.
Yes. That was a good.
I can have that for free.
Yeah, I think you've got it. It's yours.
Okay. So my point is that I am fascinated by the inner workings of all these schools and the never-ending scandals and the genre of scandals and how all these schools constantly are under media scrutiny and sort of why and the role they play in New York and then in the country at large. I am interested and surprised by the fact that you are interested in this as well. So I would love to hear what brought this to your attention, why you wanted to discuss it, and what you think would be fruitful to SLEERICKETS listeners as a conversational sort of cornerstone to this discussion.
Yeah. So just very briefly, the two stories. So I first heard about St. Anne's from this article in New York Magazine called "The Shame of St. Anne's." So the subtitle is "How Did a Brooklyn Private School Fall for an Accused Predator?" And of course, there are various titles, in various formats. But this is by Caitlin Muscatello and James Walsh. St. Anne's, being one of these schools Brian described, is has hired, or some maybe 4 years ago, hired this guy Winston Nguyen, who had already gone to jail for fraud before getting hired there, and
Yep.
then after getting hired there, ended up. It's a little bit ambiguous from the article, but he seems to have been involved in a couple of different capacities in circulating photographs of students who work, like soliciting and circulating sexual photographs of students who work there, like horrible stuff.
Yeah.
Again, slightly unclear what exactly happened, which
I
is,
think I'll be able to explain it
okay.
Based on clues in the article and
All right.
outside knowledge, but continue.
Yeah. And then in this article, it makes reference to a former student named Ellis. We can just say his first name,
Yeah.
Ellis, who went to St. Anne's, and there was an article previously in the New York Times. He went to St. Anne's for like 5, 6, 7 years, and
No,
then
more than that. He went to St.
wait, did
Anne's
he start in kindergarten?
from kindergarten through eighth
From
grade.
kindergarten through eighth grade, and then after eighth grade was asked not to come back for high school. And 3 months after that happened, he killed himself. And it's a totally horrifying story that also brings up a number of other sort of curious points in the New York Times. My interest in this is sort of like multifaceted. So, and I think it does relate to some things that have come up on the show a number of times. So one is my perpetual interest in frauds, in people, particularly in frauds who sort of wind their way into elite circles. Related to that is my interest in the sort of broader institutional fraudulence of elite institutions.
Yep.
Like a subtler, less criminal fraud that I think gets perpetuated frequently on us by elitist institutions. And then also just sort of questions about like education. And while like I didn't go to, I've never lived in New York, I have some more than passing involvement in schools that have that bear some similarities to these. Like both, I went to one in Atlanta that was similar in some ways and had some similar scandals. And then I also taught at a school in DC that also had some parallel concerns. So I'm interested in this from every angle. And then of course I knew that you would know a lot about it.
Fantastic. Yeah. So I think to take a step back and discuss St. Anne's first, it plays a unique role in New York City because it is the oldest independent school in Brooklyn. And initially, to be an independent school in Brooklyn, something needed to have like there was something sort of charming about that because you wouldn't send your kids to an independent school if you lived in Brooklyn. So it was
and why is that?
Because
you can afford it
because people who lived in Brooklyn were people who were more at the front of gentrification, and those tended not to be the people who could afford of even at the very early days a five-figure tuition for a student. So
this is a school where kindergarten starts in $50,000.
It's over that now. Kindergarten is around 60 and it goes up to 60, 66 almost. So you have what it started as was a sort of cozy, very intellectual, very lefty institution that would take people's kids and mold them into a sort of cultural elite. And you have all sorts of actors and writers and filmmakers. Like I don't know who the best personification of all this, but like Lena Dunham attended there,
Yeah,
for
yeah, yeah.
example. And like
She seems pretty perfect.
her parents are artists who grew up in
Yeah,
Brooklyn.
yeah, yeah.
And
I mentioned
then,
Jennifer Connelly, Tim Robbins, and Susan Sarandon's kids, and Julian
right,
Schnabel's kids,
Ethan
and
Hawke's kid. Like so it's a school that differs from a lot of the other schools in self-perception.
yeah,
So a cynic, and I
and
think
branding.
exactly. So a cynic and a realist, I think, would say the purpose of these schools, maybe not initially, but certainly now, the purpose is in exmissions, where the goal is to get as high a percentage.
Exmissions.
Yeah, it's the stupid word that means getting kids into college. So
Oh,
if
okay.
admissions is letting kids into your school,
Placement. Yeah, school.
ex
All right.
placement,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
school placement. So I think that the real role these schools serve now is in a perpetuation of American aristocracy, and like we can talk about that if you want to. And then
And the New Yorker, I mean, sorry, the New York Times article, I believe, said that at least according to one measure, St. Anne's was the top school in the country in
in
terms of
America, yep,
the proportion of students placed at elite colleges.
that's right. Now you have to define elite in different ways to get you that number. If you just say Ivy League, then it's not St. Anne's, but you can look at the crosstab, so to speak, and find a way to call St. Anne's the most successful in
Yeah.
placement of any school in the United States. Um, but it still considers itself different from Dalton, Trinity, Horace Mann, Brearley, Collegiate, Spence, Chapin. And the primary way that it considers itself different is it thinks of itself as a place where you don't need to be the well-rounded achievement addict who is Ivy League bound from day one to thrive there, that
Right.
you need to have interests, and this is a school that will help you explore your interests. I think the idea of a 4 to 9 year old having interests is somewhat suspect, but we can bracket that for a second, and go on. The principal difference, for the sake of these conversations, I think, though, is that St. Anne's, unlike these other schools that cost $65,000, makes a big point of disallowing parental access to the teachers. So, for
Mm.
example, at the school where I teach, it's not explicit, but part of the implicit understanding is that if you pay $65,000 a year to attend a school, and just for the sake of full disclosure, I don't pay $65,000 a year for my kids to go there. One of the reasons why I teach there is for the tuition
Yeah, yeah,
discount,
yeah.
et cetera. But I think part of the implicit agreement is that if you pay $65,000 a year to send your kids to one of these schools, and it's 40 schools maybe that cost $65,000 a year, it's not a tiny number. It's a lot.
Yeah.
You are buying smaller class size. You're buying healthier lunch and snacks. You're buying your access to a dance teacher and a separate art teacher and a separate phys eds teacher and a separate music teacher and a separate technology teacher. And, so you're buying all of that, but also you're buying an immediate response to a phone call or email. So
Yeah.
if you want to speak to your fifth grader's math teacher, you can write to that fifth grader's math teacher and expect a response about your kid specifically and his, comportment in class and how he can improve and what access he has to you and whether he needs tutoring, et cetera. St. Anne's differs in this because I think it somewhat reasonably says that actually doesn't benefit anybody, that parents
Yeah.
trying to micromanage student affairs, it can be detrimental to the parent's own psychological life, the student's, academic maturation, and the teachers' lives. Obviously, it makes teachers insane to need to constantly talk to parents. So what St. Anne says, and I think it was a line from, I think, the New York Times piece on the suicide, but like the jokey slogan goes like, you give us your kids in kindergarten and we give them back to you in 12th grade or upon graduation. So the fact that, oh, no, it wasn't the suicide argument. I'm sorry, the article. It was the other article.
Yeah,
because
yeah,
the
yeah.
fact that this school asks
Yeah, they downplayed that line with the other kids.
right, explicit permission to say, you are not going to be interacting. You just have to trust us because what we do here is extraordinary. It's exceptional. It's for the kid, and it's safe and we're careful and we take care of everything that could make you anxious. The fact that that school hired a teacher without any math teaching experience who had already been arrested for fraud, who was, turns out, a child sex predator, was especially difficult for the parent body at St. Anne's to take. And now I say that and roll my eyes a little bit because it's not like that would be any less difficult for you or me if we
Right.
heard that our kid, was hanging out with this guy either. But in terms of the hypocrisy, which it tends to be the easiest place to start these conversations, it was especially galling.
Hypocrisy, but I would imagine also a sense that you had, to some extent, rolled this die when you signed your kid over to a school that wouldn't give you access. Like that to some extent, like I can imagine that part of the gall is I kind of agreed to not look into this. Like I agreed not to have access to feeling things out with this teacher along the way.
Totally. And that feeling, I think, is similar at a lot of child-focused elite institutions, even outside academia. So I think that kind of guilt, thankfully, nobody at St. Anne's that we know of was sexually assaulted. There was some exchange of photographs.
That was very unclear from the article.
Yeah. So it's as far as I know, nobody was actually molested or raped. But it
said that there were children who were taken. Yeah. Okay. All right. Very confusingly written.
Yeah.
There were like two separate things, both of which were bad and both of which involved children and adults and sex. But it was, yeah. All right. So but it seemed to be photos, which is bad, but not as bad. Maybe.
Right. And sending and asking of photos. What seemed to be purposefully ambiguous in this article, and probably not on the journalist's part, but on the whoever gave the journalist information part, is that it is unclear whether any of these kids actually photographed themselves naked or performing sexual acts and sending it to the teacher. That's where I saw the ambiguity. Okay. We're certain the teacher sent these photos to the kids over WhatsApp, I think. Not WhatsApp, Snapchat, I think. And we know that the kids received the photos from the teacher. We know that the teacher asked for photos in return. And that's where the ambiguity is in my mind. Okay. But just going back to what I was saying earlier about generally parents and elite institutions and the guilt that's implicit in there is I think you have people who deal with like Juilliard in their younger programs think that there are these dance lessons which are not abusive to this extent, but, mangled feet and all sorts of eating disorders and, puberty delayed and all sorts of things. And, you see that in the world of gymnastics. You see that in the world in any athletics where everything else is sort of put to the side, where kids get welcomed into these institutions and parents say, you know what, it's worth it. And they don't really think what the it is that is worth. And I think that that for the suicide article, it's just so raw. The grandparental and parental response saying like, but I thought we were signing up for something better than this because a kid died and they are full of rage. And I also totally least important part of this conversation, but I did want to talk about some of the decisions that the journalist wrote, John Leland made about the suicide article and how he handled who to blame and how, because I think he made some decisions I wouldn't have made. And I wanted to hear your take on that. But, but yes, so that was all I want to say. So yes, St. Anne's is, I think, the perfect, ugliest place for these things to go on because of that agreement that you are signing your kids' safety and development away.
Yeah. This was reading these two articles side by side was, I don't know, dizzying in a way because they're both terrible. The school looks quite bad in both of them. However, the outcome of one is so much worse than the outcome of the other.
Yes.
And the school is far less to blame in that case than it is. Like the school is outrageously culpable in the case of hiring and continuing to hire and just basically coddling this fucking broad child predator. And then looks callous and self-serving and small-minded in the case of the kid who fucking died.
Yeah.
But it's just sort of like I don't know I can't figure out where to like rest my heart or my anger in either of
So
these.
I think it's
You know?
some ways easier to talk about the kid who committed suicide
Yeah, yeah,
because it's so because suicide is just such a nebulous
yeah, yeah.
topic that I think the moral question is one that we can play around with a little bit with the suicide issue because
Sure.
we have no idea why this kid killed himself.
No,
Kids,
no, no, no.
people commit suicide for all sorts of reasons that you and I maybe you think you could get close to it. I don't understand it at
I have
any.
some thoughts about, I mean, again, I can't speculate about this kid specifically. I have some thoughts about how it works in a way that is like, I think it is complex and it is mysterious and it is terrible. I also think that angle has been a little bit overplayed lately in some conversations, specifically about this kind of coverage, because people want to be so cautious about making public statements about causality for
And
good
what was
reason, for
so
very good reason.
I totally agree with you. And what is fascinating about this situation is the father of Ellis and the grandfather are asserting causality
Okay.
without much ambiguity.
Yeah.
I mean, the grandfather says, "Your school killed my kid,"
Yes.
and the father doesn't go that far, but
It comes
is
pretty close.
is
Yeah.
is building a case. You know,
Yeah.
where the only I don't know plausible accusation is that the school killed his kid. So, in order to talk about their accusations, I think it is most fair and I think reasonable to see it from the school's perspective. So the school let in a 3, 4, 5 year old. I don't know exactly how old he was. And the school, the word rigorous is used all the time now, and I don't really know what that means. But when Ellis was in third grade, he saw a neuropsych evaluator, which
Mhm.
is, you're familiar with that
Just like
process?
for autism.
No. So it
Okay.
is used for autism, but in this world of New York City independent schools, and increasingly to establish IEPs, individual education plans for public schools, people will sit for hours and hours and hours of testing on different sorts of strengths and weaknesses. So intellectual, short-term memory, long-term memory, numeracy, dyslexia, autism, like
Okay.
anything. And then at the end, the evaluator gives you this big stack of papers with the raw data that is accumulated in these meetings with the kid, and then
Okay.
with suggestions on how to move forward. Now, as a part of my running the tutoring business, I've read something like 500 of these,
What
and
the fuck? How
and
long are they?
60 pages each, maybe.
Jesus. Okay.
Um, I mean, I've scanned the
Sure.
data
Yeah.
in it,
Yeah.
and then you get the results. And out of the 500, I have seen zero that have said there's nothing wrong with the kid. All of them,
And they said that like between a third and a half of kids every year at St. Anne's get these.
exactly. So it is a huge proportion of kids. A third and a half seemed apocryphally high to me, but
Right.
that's what the article said. But again,
But a large number. You
a
know.
large number get them, and it isn't a random sampling because those who are getting them are getting them because there is some issue at school. So
Yeah.
it's not like everybody's being submitted to these tests and then everybody comes back. But literally, of the approximately 500 I've read, every single one of them has found some problem with the kid.
Right. It's like a
And
sensitivity reader report that's like, no, everything's great. You're very sensitive.
right, doesn't exist. So not only is there the problem with the kid, he comes in, he's often it's in the, well, she's 80th percentile in terms of memory and mathematical aptitude,
Yeah.
but 20th percentile in terms of focus and attention. It's almost always that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And therefore they suggest what are now called executive function strategies to help, which is time management and physical organization and taking big assignments and making them smaller and back planning large ones to take chunks and to calendar and to write lists and all these things that generally help students achieve. So when this kid, Ellis, was in second or third grade, he went to have his neuropsychological evaluation, which found out that he was dyslexic and had some other issues as well. They asked the neuropsych evaluator, do you think these results suggest that my kid shouldn't be at St. Anne's anymore? And the evaluator said what is not always said, but what is often said, which is no. With the correct supports in place, Ellis could potentially thrive at St. Anne's. St. Anne's has a lot of opportunity to have Ellis pursue the arts in ways that maybe he'll be interested in. They have learning specialists who can help him, buttress some of his areas that need support. So that was in third grade. The school decided otherwise in third grade. The school said, you know what? We've struggled with Ellis. He had this neuropsych eval. It doesn't seem like he's a great fit for the school. You should look elsewhere. The parents at that point said, hey, wait a minute. We thought the whole thing with the school is that everybody's special and the neuropsych evaluator says that my kid can do it. So why can't he do it? And the school essentially relented and said, fine, keep on going to St. Anne's. We'll do this together.
Right.
Fast forward 5 years. And at the end of 8th grade, they said, I'm sorry, St. Anne's High School is not the place for Ellis. And that is euphemistically termed counseling out in the business. So in third grade, they attempted to counsel Ellis out, but was met with, friction and decided it wasn't worth it. In 8th grade, they made the decision that, you know what, it's better for the institution, better for Ellis, for him not to be allowed back. Yeah. Ellis hadn't known up until this point that the school thought he might not be good for the school. His parents didn't tell him about it in 3rd or 4th grade. It didn't come up in middle school. And then when it was time to tell Ellis that he wasn't allowed back at St. Anne's, the place that had welcomed him theoretically his whole life and the only real community he had known, at least for during the school year, they said, sorry, we have to apply elsewhere. He said, why? Is it that St. Anne's doesn't want me? The parents had to say yes. He was shocked, saddened, disheartened, and then shortly thereafter took his own life.
Yes.
So to me, I'm not sure there are any bad actors in that story. And I want to know whether that's because I am a prisoner of these institutions or not. But so you accept a kid when he is 4 or 5 because essentially of his family. You can't interview a 4 or 5-year-old. People call me all the time to ask me if my business will prep a kid for
an interview. Oh my God.
3K interviews. And often the kids are 3 at that time. And we say no because it's con artistry. It's snake oil.
Just make him go pee right beforehand. That's the best thing.
Exactly. Good night's sleep and vacate your bowels if possible. And you accept a kid based on the family. The family seems nice. The father's an artist. The mom, I think, is also engaged in the arts. They seem to love their kid. So they accepted the kid.
But also with the grandfather is a huge
gazillionaire
New York developer, owns a quarter of New York or something. And the dad is not just an artist. He's a baker of a very, very highly praised, celebrated bakery.
Exactly. So in some ways, this is the ideal candidate, the ideal applicant, because they're sitting on an infinite number of dollars, which means that when it comes to development, you can ask them to donate money in addition, because as these schools so frequently like to tell you honestly, even though they charge $65,000 a year for 3rd graders, it costs more than $65,000 a year to educate a 3rd grader in these institutions. So they rely on their endowment, and their endowment in turn relies on giving. So the ideal candidate for a school like St. Anne's is parents who are have high reputations in their art adjacent fields, backed by grandparents who have an infinite amount of money who will donate in the future. So totally makes sense why this school accepts the kid. Third grade, they say the kid seems to be struggling. And at that point, they say we should get him tested. The tests come back and they say, you know what? Like, this might not be great. This could add to more frustrations than benefits. There are other schools that maybe specialize in helping kids like Ellis. You should consider going elsewhere. The parents said, no, we really want to give this a try. The school said, okay, then let's give this a try. 5 years later, it still wasn't really working out. We don't know the details, but from the school's perspective, we know that they've decided that in spite of the gazillion dollars and the parental kindness, as far as we can tell, this kid really just isn't a right fit for our school. Ninth grade is the time when people often change schools, both into St. Anne's and into other schools. So that's the most generous time to tell a kid that this school isn't right for you. And they said, we're putting our foot down now, and it was nice knowing you. I don't know.
Am I being a little too cynical in noting in the article that between the kid's acceptance and his dismissal, the very prestigious and much newspapered about, but not especially profitable bakery closed?
I don't know. I don't know. I would be shocked if fancy bakery guy gets, because you're talking about a parent body that has all these artists. But again, if you can afford whatever percentage of the school is on financial aid, separate them out for a moment. But if you can afford $65,000 a year post taxes, it also means you can afford 130, because most likely you're sending two kids there. You know, the average family is sending two kids there. So post-tax, 130 grand a year. And that's not including all of the after school stuff, much of the tutoring, all of the summer stuff, nannies, like the aggressive chess or tennis training. I mean, it means that you're making more than $1 million a year, and considerably more in most circumstances. So it usually means hedge funds or commercial real estate, or the very, very, very top earning.
Oh, no, I didn't think it was a financial thing. I was just saying that the prestige of having like another little thing, you know.
So at a school where there's so much prestige floating around, maybe if it was, you know, I'm trying to think whose kid, but, you know, maybe if it was Ethan Hawke's kid, they would have, you know, taken him through high school. I just don't think that a fancy baker, like, you've never heard of the name of that bake. I just don't know how much real prestige there is there.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that seems reasonable enough. I mean, I think you're right in that there is a perspective from which all of the school's decisions make pretty good sense. I think, unfortunately, it's where there's a real conflict is, as the parents are not wrong to point out, between the brand of the school and the actual practical decisions the school has to make, that it needs to pretend to be something it's not. And she, even in third grade, says the school ultimately allowed him to return for fourth grade when Mrs. LaRiviere told an administrator that St. Anne's, this is the kid's mom, told St. Anne's that told an administrator that St. Anne's should inform parents that it sometimes asked students to leave. And she didn't know this was a thing they did. And she said, you should tell people that you do sometimes ask students to leave. She said she was told, we can't do that because the parents would be stressing out their kids. And I said, I wouldn't have applied to the school if I knew that this happened.
Yes. So,
and even if you listen to like the lines that are much quoted from the founder of the school, it's like, hey, if the kid needs to learn under the table, that you got better go on, which is, again, like great theory, like terrible idea, even in like a classroom of 5, that's a terrible idea. Like,
totally agree. And the other element that we need to include now, yes, but the other element we need to include now that we've forgotten is it is, if not unique, one of very, very, very few schools, and I think the only one of its status that does not give grades.
Right.
All the way through, even in middle and high school, which means
they don't actually have a metric to say,
right,
here's what he's failing to do.
Which means that if parents knew that there was a chance that they would kick out your kid if you didn't do well academically, and they are not seeing whether the kid is maintaining a B+, the parents would absolutely freak out. Yeah. And that is a little bit of blackmail, which kept the kid in the school through 8th grade.
Yeah. And it's important that we maintain the illusion that this can't happen. which is, I mean, to me, that just seems like there is basically it's almost like in magazines you have like the commercial and editorial side, or what are the two sides of the magazine where you have like,
the business side and the edit side.
Yeah, and like supposedly there's like a wall between like choices about who's advertising and choices about what you write up, and sometimes that wall is permeable. But it does seem like there's a little bit of like, at the level of like classroom management and like reasonable decisions about educating individual students, there's some perfectly understandable and justifiable decisions being made. It's just that those decisions aren't really all that compatible with the very publicly advertised spirit of the school.
True. But
I also think there's one like fatal error the school made that is not, it's way like, in a way, almost a cosmetic one. But the second I read it, I made the sound that you made when I told you about the Brave Girls, School for Brave Girl, whatever. Brave Girl.
Yeah.
Let me get Mr. Gural, which is the father of the kid. Mr. Gural demanded that Mr. Tompkins is the head of the school.
Was at the time.
Yeah. And which, by the way, like in the other article, when people are campaigning to get him fired, you said like, this is, St. Anne's is different from all these other schools, Trinity, Dalton. In that article, he was already on his way out the door to go run Dalton, or no, not Dalton,
Trinity. Yeah.
So
he
like
was assistant head. He was assistant head here, and then he was going to Trinity. Exactly.
All right. So Mr. Gural demanded that Mr. Tompkins explain to the community how, in the middle of all this talk of DEI, 3 professionals got together and decided that their institution has no place for a bright, creative, caring gay child because he has learning differences. When the school informed parents that a student had died by suicide without also telling them that the student had recently been asked to leave the school, Mr. Gural was incensed. I was apoplectic, he said, because it did not contextualize in any way what the issues were in my son's suicide. And it said the school is being proactive to deal with this mental health crisis. Here they are presenting information about my son's death in the most flattering way possible, totally dishonest. And again, on the one hand, I can understand there being some reasonable justification for like, well, we can't not address this. This is a major issue in the school's community. We have to address it. We certainly don't want to put down on paper anything that could suggest a causal relationship between something we did and this happening. And we need to tell the students that we will support them in any, basically in any mental health crises that develop in response to this actual mental health crisis. I understand their thinking, fatal error, because I would say my argument would be if they did not send that letter, or at least did not send that letter in that way, I don't know that there would be a lawsuit, or at least it would be that I don't know. I certainly don't think the dad would be on a war path the way he is now, because to me, like I read that and I was angry.
Yeah.
And I think it's a combination of like invoking your kid's death while also totally excusing yourself from any culpability.
But I can tell you exactly what they were thinking at the time, which is a member of last year's 8th grade killed himself.
Yeah.
Right. We as a school take mental health seriously, and we have to address this, because if there's no statement by the school, then it seems like they're abdicating any type of, safety or authority or anything like that. So then you sit down to write the message. And what do you write? You can't write after we told him he couldn't attend anymore, he killed himself, because
no, of course not. Yeah.
So what do you do there? Like, again, I agree. It's ugly. Every part of this is ugly, but I don't think that in this piece there are any villains. I think that if you wanted to take a slightly larger step back and say the real problem of New York City independent schools is that they see themselves as a source of social justice, when in fact what they are is, as I said, like a way to make sure that members of the elite maintain their
reproduction of that class
and their elite, right? Like that I think is the forgive me, Ryan, but like the initial sin of all of this, original sin of every conversation. Where
in the Winston Nguyen article, like both people who were angry at the school and people at the school defending the school were both invoking DEI in a way that felt like this is beside the point. Like this is not actually what either of you was talking about.
Exactly. So like that that to me is problematic. But the parents wanted to get do the best by their kid. The kid wanted to go to school with his friends and do his stuff. The school wanted to take care of the kid, but didn't think the kid would succeed there. I don't.
Yeah. No, I mean, I would say like, I think there's a good reason behind everything the school did. Also, if you are a reasonable person working for the school and you see all of these things happening and you're about to send this letter, if you do not have the thought, yes, we will definitely be getting sued. They had to know this was what was going to happen. Like, in a way, that is an almost as rational a result as everything else. I mean, I think it's a kind of a misplaced lawsuit, and I don't love the idea of people getting sued over things like this, but it seems like, what would you possibly expect to happen?
Totally. So that's
particularly when like you've got the grandfather who's a gajillionaire behind it.
I know. And that's but I keep on harping on the fact that I don't really blame anyone at St. Anne's for this, even though they are clearly blameable in some way, because I blame so much about this Winston Nguyen situation.
They're so
on St. Anne's. They made like 100 unforgivable errors. Do you want to talk about this guy as a con artist before we get into him as a teacher?
Yeah. I mean,
because he's a fun con artist.
He is a less talented Mr. Ripley. I mean, he really
but he's pretty talented. He got he attended Columbia, legitimately. He seemed to do well. I don't know. What did you make of the weird way they talked about?
He also he genuinely, it's almost like the guy in Catch Me If You Can, like he had to fake all these things, but like he also had to actually pass the bar. Like Winston Nguyen like faked his way through 100 different things, but then he also actually was really good at Jeopardy and won a bunch of money.
He won. He not only got on Jeopardy, but he won Jeopardy.
Like
that day, which is really hard to do.
Which is very difficult. Like, it's very difficult even to get on to Jeopardy. Like, you actually have to know a lot of shit.
Yes.
He was maybe not talented enough, or maybe his reach exceeded his grasp. Yeah. So he went to Columbia.
He did.
He did not graduate from Columbia, although a lot of people got the impression that he did, including his own family.
Yes. And possibly St. Anne's.
Yes. He while at Columbia, he was there's some great photos of him. I think my favorite is the one of him at the high roller table.
I'm looking for it.
He was very dapper. He had a kind of a uniform French cuffs bow tie. He was a big spender. He was always buying his friends drinks and dinner and taking them out and treating them to things. There was an idea that like, oh, this is sort of Jeopardy money, although like the scale doesn't even come close to covering it. He was a big gambler. He was a big donor to the ballet. He like gave a lot. I mean, he also apparently harassed a lot of ballerinas.
Right. So it seemed like maybe one of the reasons he was, or maybe the reason he was a donor to the ballet. It seemed like
he's like getting access to the ballerinas was the main.
See the dancers.
But it's such an interesting angle on a fraud. Like, I'm going to steal money to donate it to the ballet so I can get access to ballerinas. And so, I mean, it did seem like he was very much selling an image. In a way, like, his biggest problem was that it didn't seem like he had the right. He didn't quite figure out how to make use of the image that he cultivated. Like, he did pretty successfully present himself as this dazzling, charming, rich, high-rolling guy, and he spent a lot of time around people who were later to be in the elite, and he gained a little bit of a reputation with some local institutions, but he didn't quite know how to parlay that to like a gig, a thing.
Right. So the only place that I would differ from that statement is that I think he wanted to parlay that into being a child sex fiend. Like what's so interesting to me about this, and what the article didn't make clear is what his goal was in any of this. Because like, if you were the Catch Me If You Can guy, you wouldn't want the end result to be making $67,000 a year as a math teacher as a prestigious
No.
middle schools. You're right. Like it
Though, do
doesn't
you
make any
think that would have
sense.
been his, do you think that would have been his goal before he went to jail, or do you think that was the best he could do after jail?
I have no idea. All I know is that so he was this big spender and he actually did spend all this money. The way he got the money was by stumbling into this, or I guess charming his way into this assistant job with this, the
An elderly
patriarch
couple. Yeah.
of the Stoll fortune, which
Right.
I wasn't familiar with, Stoll. And he stole more than $300,000 from them. He just by writing, fake checks and opening up fake accounts. So with that money, he went and gave money to the ballet and took out his friends to Hamilton and fancy meals and all this
Yeah.
this wacky stuff. But we don't get why. And at least I was left with the impression that he did it so he could look at ballet dancers when they were changing their clothes.
Yeah.
And after that, he ended up at, and he has this like really smarmy thing. There's this great detail so he was in prison, and he used his time at prison because clearly he's like the most educated guy and ambitious like young man in prison.
Rikers
So
Island.
he calls at Rikers usually a jail, but it seems like he was
he did his
there.
sentence. It was like a 6-month
Did a
sentence.
sentence there, and he's busy calling WNYC, the local NPR affiliate, to its most prestigious show, the Brian Lehrer Show, to talk about how the mail service isn't working well, and there's no program for mothers to visit newborns, and like
They have an overly rigid definition of sexually explicit material.
Right. Well, right. Because he can't stop himself there. But like there's too strict of moral code. But that means he's waiting online to use a payphone, listening to WNYC, calling into the Brian Lehrer Show to make this comment about prison food. And like from there, he got out and applied for a job during COVID. Now, the reason why that's important is because all hiring went nuts during COVID. And like at my school, for example, it went from a very rigorous hiring program where you have to go through rounds of applications and background checks and in-person interviews and sample lessons to essentially like, we need people to be here while the kids are doing remote learning. So I, as a teacher, taught for almost a year from home. And then like a bunch of randos were there watching the kids. And a lot of them were former students. A lot of them were young.
Wait. We're where watching the kids?
So we're at school. So because they're
kids were at school?
Yes. And I was teaching them from home.
Wait, but they were all collected in one place together?
Yes. Because
what was the good of keeping you at home if they were all infecting each other?
I didn't want to go into school.
Oh, you just had the liberty.
I have a neurological disorder, and so a lot of teachers, also a lot of teachers had young kids, and there weren't yet. People were nervous. They didn't know what this disease did. So a lot of times these people who would come in would be people of his age who are in their, mid-20s, didn't have families yet, were willing to work in person.
Kind of childminders.
And the childminders. And it turns out that like at my school, we ended up hiring a couple of those guys. They were great. And like now one is they work in various capacities in schools as educators, and they went through, but this guy slipped around. So he started as like a childminder, but I have a mutual friend with him who told me that he was also just like preternaturally good at logistics in a way that you would imagine somebody who's very good at Jeopardy might be. So he could figure out how to get 1,000 students into groups, into buses, into places, just like way quicker than everybody else could. So he went from like childminder to like logistics guy. And then from logistics guy to picking up a math class, like that's not too far in a New York City independent school where you don't have to be an accredited teacher to teach there.
And one of the points that comes back again and again is that St. Anne's is especially loose and opaque about hiring requirements.
Yes. Yes. So they have, it's not public, but I know they have like currently successful New Yorker essayists teaching English there.
Right.
Because like you can't make a living as a New Yorker essayist.
Sure.
So like those people, I know of one for the New Yorker, one from somebody else. One of them happens to be a spectacular teacher. The other one's an awful teacher, but there are these sort of prestigious intellectuals who, if they hang out with the kids, can maybe help the kids in some ways. So this guy fits that realm. He won on Jeopardy. He had this really sharp mind when it came to spaces and numbers and the ability to do certain work. A math job was open. I'm sure he said, "Hey, you mind if I pick up a math class?" And super charismatic. Kids really liked him. And I mean, as you know, those are the ones you have to be worried about, but they didn't do any background checks. They didn't look into this. And then when they did,
he lied a lot on his application.
Lied a lot in his application.
But not about the jail.
No, exactly.
Like that was the one thing he made a point. He pitched it as an angle that this is like, oh, I've learned from this, and like I have an insight into injustice, and this is he was savvy enough to like lie about having had teaching experience.
Yep.
But be very upfront about having gone to jail.
Right. And they bought into this. This is the administration at St. Anne's bought into this to the point where not only did they give him the math class, but they also gave him a class to teach on punitive justice. I forget what they call it, but like why jail is bad.
Some of that seems like some of that may have come up after there was kind of an initial parental ruffling of the feathers when some people learned about his history. So he kind of went through several phases at St. Anne's, and his ultimate phase was teaching explicitly about his own experience in jail, and then preying on students as well.
Right. So what is I think, indefensible initial mistake is hiring somebody who stole more than $300,000 from the elderly.
Right.
Like, so many people want these jobs. Why? Like even if he's a reformed convict, we're not supposed to, incarcerated person, and you want to demonstrate your sort of right thinking, left leaning, why would you choose this guy who's stolen so much money from the elderly? It just seems
there's a funny distinction made where like the school says like, oh, he was arrested for financial crimes, and there's a distinction where like, because I was thinking like, okay, financial crimes, like I guess not every financial crime is a crime that involves like such a personal, intimate form of fraud. But then like, I don't know, doesn't all financial crime, like, I don't know, like
totally agree with you. Totally agree with you. But if you were to say that I just heard that my daughter's math teacher had been arrested for financial crimes, your mind would go to the same place my mind went to, which is what?
Insider trading,
right? Like in sort of some kind of business, like
and some antiseptic,
on some information,
number moving crime,
right? Where
not like I helped this old man every day and was admitted into his life and bedroom and stole checks from his
desk. And when
desk
he was asleep, I wrote people checks out of his, like that. Like that's not a financial crime.
No,
that's like elder abuse. Like you can't. I mean, so. I just don't understand. There's no real excuse for that.
No.
Other than the fact that this guy must have been incredibly compelling, right? Like he must have been really convincing.
And he had great timing.
Right. But again, to your eye, was all of this so he could just hang out with kids and gawk at them? Because that's where, reading this article, I'm just so confused. He reached out on Snapchat to to students, 10, 11, 12, 13 years old, who all went, as far as I can tell, to independent Brooklyn middle schools. And he pretended to be a student at a Brooklyn middle school as well. I don't see the rationale for that unless his end goal would be meeting up with these kids, because otherwise, why are they? Again, it's hard to get yourself into the mind of a child sex predator, but I don't know if he knew what he was doing, but it's all a little bit confusing to me. Like what's being intimated and what happened and what the purpose is and who is actually hurt. And
I mean, because there's also like, okay, so he's also preying on, before that, ballerinas who at a professional company, these would have been at least 18. And if they
I was
were
going to
actually
say
people he
18
was
to
meeting in the
22.
company, they were
Yeah.
probably older than that because they probably had been there long enough to make it kind of through the corps de ballet and actually be somebody he would have noticed at all. So like they are often very tiny and they've had delayed puberty, but like they don't look like 10-year-olds. And it also seems like it's both boys and girls, and it's like 20-year-old ballerinas and 10-year-old children. A thought that came to mind. So a couple things came to mind. One, I should say a little bit about my own experience, which is I went to in Atlanta, very different, milieu and very different price point. I went to a hippy dippy school where up until high school there were no grades, and it was very, very similar to the way St. Anne sounds. The mayor's kids went there. The
Right.
L.A. Reid's daughter went there. It was, for being Atlanta, it was a similar kind of place. Right, like my second year there, the longtime photography teacher who had been with the school since its founding was arrested for
Jesus.
for having installed cameras in rental properties and filming young women without their knowledge.
God.
And then the year before I left there, or no, actually it may have been the year after I left because my siblings went there as well. A custodian was arrested for having installed cameras in the bathrooms.
No
way. High school.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so like I then later taught at actually a school for ballet dancers, like a third or fourth through 12th grade school. I taught in high school, and there were a lot of strange qualities to the school, but like something that was there. A friend of mine also taught. I got her a job there. A friend of mine taught there as well, and like in a way that was never something one could quite put a finger on, but like one got a very strong impression. There was definitely at least one teacher there, if not a couple, who had a noteworthy interest in the personal goings on of 11, 12-year-old girls. And like men who would sort of volunteer to go chaperone it. Like we were asked if we wanted to, like, oh, would you like to chaperone the dance? Fuck no. Like,
no, it's the worst.
Do you want to chaperone there's going to be a lock-in
and $25 stipend.
Like, Jesus Christ. Right. Like, exactly. That's the last thing I would want to do. Yeah. So like a 29-year-old guy saying like, ooh, me. Like, ah. So like, I think like a couple things. Like one is that all schools are honeypots for like, okay. So like people have written about this. They're pedophiles, people who have an innate attraction to children. Yes. There are child molesters. The Venn diagram turns out to be like very not circular between those two things.
Because of the power dynamic tends to be the explanation that the child molesters are dealing with.
So like a lot of child molesters are not themselves pedophiles, and a lot of pedophiles are not child. So like I do feel like it's sort of worth making distinctions. There is like it's a small percentage anyway, but like there is a percentage of mostly very anonymous, virtuous pedophiles who are born with a horrible curse none of us would wish on our worst enemy, and who then choose to do their best to not act on it. There are then some who, deal with child pornography, like, in the way that this guy did. And then there are also people who prey on children for a variety of reasons. And some of those may have to do with attraction. So like, I don't know even what word to use, but like there are, like any school where children is going to be a honeypot for people who prey on children or are interested in children in an unseemly way. And then a school that has lax or unclear hiring practices is be an especially attractive destination. And so I think to some extent,
and to add to that, a school where parents aren't allowed to interact and get in between and intermediate between kids and faculty.
Which was very much the school I taught at as well. And like, I loved that about it. And I loved teaching there. It was a wonderful place to teach. There were some other fantastic teachers there. I think I did a good job, but also like, there wasn't really any particular reason they should have expected me to do a good job. And God help them if I had been not a like decent guy who wanted to do a good job. Because there were very few safeguards. So part of me wonders about like, there being kind of an inevitable problem with almost like, it's just like ants are going to like crawl toward a place like this.
Yeah.
But then the other thought that came to mind. And this is where I really don't know what respectable mainstream thinking is, because like because reality is so much stranger than fiction in the case of Jeffrey Epstein. So, like, I know for one thing, if you think that he did not commit suicide, you're a crazy conspiracy theorist, even though that it seems like, I don't know. Sometimes it's hard for me to believe he committed suicide. But
he taught at Dalton, which is where I went.
Right. Well, like he taught at Dalton. He was hired without a college degree to teach at Dalton, with no teaching experience to teach math. Was extremely popular with the kids. Was very charismatic. Was buddied up with the head of the school, and very quickly transitioned from that into running a financial firm where lots of extremely rich and powerful people entrusted him with large amounts of money. Whether or not he ever made any money is completely unclear, and there was definitely no reason, no track record to suggest that he should have made money. And so this is where, like, I know you're a crazy person if you think he got murdered by powerful people in charge, but also it seems very difficult to explain his story without some assumption that, like, a lot of very powerful people in charge had reason to keep him protected, possibly because he had blackmail information on them.
Yes.
But what does that have to do with him? He was himself a creep who was attracted to young girls, but that may not have been his primary business. His primary business may have been the facilitation of creepiness with young girls for other rich and powerful people that he surrounded himself with for opaque reasons. So,
yes,
to me, like, in a way,
I agree with all that.
Winston Nguyen seemed like an aspiring Jeffrey Epstein. Like, maybe he was himself a creep who had creepy behavior toward young women or men or girls or boys, but also it seemed like he was that maybe part of his aspiration was actually to get in with not just to be a solo artist, but to be involved in a powerful cabal of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Epstein.
I don't know how crazy these thoughts are, but it's like.
Well, no, I mean, of every human being I've ever heard the story of, Nguyen's story sounds the most like Jeffrey Epstein. I mean,
like a failed Epstein. Yeah,
but we only have a precedent of one, right? Like, I just don't know. Like, they're both super charismatic, unqualified math teachers who had unusual sexual
New York City
predilections
schools,
in New York City independent schools. So, like, I don't know where to go with this story. Like, it seems bad. Like, it seems like the school didn't do due diligence over and over again and was blinded by its own goody two-shoesness, where they didn't cut bait earlier. I am fascinated by both of these articles' attempt to handle blame.
Whenever I get to edit an episode that has Brian in it, there's always one thing that he says that no matter how many times I listen back to it, it makes me laugh every time. And in this episode, it's where he says, "It seems bad." Yeah, it seems really bad. Like, really, really bad. I don't know. To me, this, like I said, it sounds like something out of a movie or something that's happening on another planet. I went to a pretty basic school. The only rule we had was no bare feet. The biggest scandal we had was that time that Patrick did a nudie run at the end of year 12. And if I looked like Patrick, I would have done a nudie run too. So in The Secret Show, we are going to hear about how the articles attempt to handle blame, as Brian said. Also, it is very much worth your time because the conversation includes a hilarious discussion between Matthew and Brian about lice and what's appropriate to talk about during sex, and Adrian Rich. You did not want to miss it. Head over to SLEERICKETS.substack.com. You can get a week's access for free, and there are many, many more silly and gossipy episodes waiting for you over there. You can also join in our conversation on the Substack chat if you sign up. Thank you all for listening. You can reach Matthew, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. And with any luck, we will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.